All right, welcome in to another episode of the Fit Parent Podcast. Today, I'm joined by strength and wellness coach, passionate for moms, Jonathan Angelilli, who's part of the mastermind that I'm part of. And Jonathan and I have kind of gotten to chat back and forth now for the last few months, and I'm excited to have him on. He just reached out to me and he's like, "Hey, it was one of the coolest things actually that we were like on the middle of a call, and you sent me a message. You were like." Hey, you looking for people to come in? I was like, that's the coolest thing ever. Is I don't know if I've ever had anybody like, hey, can I come on? Which was so fun and just tells you everything you need to know about Jonathan. So strength and wellness coach, was in New York City, now lives in Montreal, but still travels to New York City to train some of his clients who he's had for a long time, which again tells you all you need to know about him. Passionate about helping moms. So thanks for coming on, Jonathan.
Jeff, thank you. It's such a pleasure.
So I want to start here because I think that you have a little bit of a cool perspective on this. So your brand or your company or however you want to call it is BMN, which stands for Breathe, Move, Nourish. And I think that particularly with moms that you work a lot with and I work a lot with, right? What made you kind of think through those three things and in the order that you put them? Because I think that there's probably, knowing you, an intentionality to the order that you put those in. Um, how did that come about, BMN and those kind of three pillars for you?
Yeah, breathing is primary, and our body physiology will go through leaps and hoops just to make sure we can keep breathing. But just because we all breathe because we're alive doesn't mean we're doing it optimally. So I like the sound of breathe, move, nourish, just the way it hits the ear. And I also like that it puts breathing first because I think so many people, especially overwhelmed parents, can change their life just by working on the quality of their breathing.
Yeah. So as you think about what does, I guess, quality breathing and intentional breathing and maximizing that effort, what does that look like versus just, okay, I'm breathing because I'm existing?
I mean, that's a great question. It's a vast universe of techniques, and my approach is very accessible. So I just like to get people thinking about it first and doing it in a mindful way, paying attention to it while they're doing activities that they already do for 1 to 2 or 3 minutes at a time when they start. So, we do something called the rescue breathing, which in the literature is called cyclic breathing. It's a double inhale through the nose and a long exhale through the mouth. And as far as the studies show, it's pretty much the breathing technique with the best data around it as far as helping people calm their nervous system down. And that's kind of my approach is if I can help people calm down through their breathing, then they have more energy, they just enjoy their life better, they stop feeling so exasperated. And yeah, so it's a kind of very practical approach to breathing.
Yeah. Well, because you have two kids, right? You said 9 and 4. I have three small kids, and so the demands on our life, I feel like, are constant. Where we can't totally control the external stimulation that is our lives, but we can control the internal piece of it. So, as you think about practically applying that for you, and we'll just go right into super practical for you or your clients, this cyclic breathing, right? How do you insert that into the day-to-day life that then can be applied to these different situations, certainly, but like, where's maybe a good place to start with that if you're like, all right, I the double inhale, because I talked about that on the episode that I did about stress. If you haven't listened to that, that's a good one to look into. But that idea of like long
Mm,
exhale, give your
mm.
diaphragm room to expand, and in your heart room to expand. I'm sorry, your diaphragm contracts so your heart has room to expand. So as you think about that, how do we kind of bring that forward, and why is that so important?
Hmm. Yeah, our breathing is our quickest way to shift our psyche, our experience of being alive and our awareness and perceptions of being in this body and alive. So breathing is directly linked to that. So we can shift our mood and our mentality, and not just in a psychological way, but in a physiological way. I like to approach it, what is the existing landscape of a student's day? So perhaps it's a really new mom who's breastfeeding. That's a
Mm-hmm.
wonderful time. She's got to breastfeed every day. That's a wonderful time. Or maybe she's making the milk bottle. That's a wonderful time to practice some rescue breathing. You already have to do the thing, and if you just link it with this other thing, then we call it habit stacking. And
Mm-hmm.
our children, as I'm sure you know, are they co-regulate. They're learning. They build their immune system and their nervous system and their ability to regulate off of ours. So the way we are in our body is 90% of what we're teaching our children, and then the other 10% is what we say or scream or yell.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it can be, or some, when they're pushing the stroller or going for walks, or the one time I just really advise people to not do breath work is when they're in the car, because it really can shift your focus and take you out of your outer experience a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's a danger thing. But other than that, finding something you have to do every day where it might be really useful to be calm and relaxed,
Mm-hmm.
connecting the practice with that habit, and then going from there. And what's amazing is, even if you just do 5 minutes, I mean, the research, I'm sure, as you know, it can shift how you breathe in the night. Just doing 5 minutes in the daytime, it doesn't just end there. It kind of helps people reset a little bit.
Um,
Cool.
Sorry, we had some technical issues there, so we're going to come right back with what Jonathan was saying. But you're talking about stacking habits with things that you're naturally doing, and then how that kind of can impact uh, our day-to-day experience.
Yeah, we call it opportunistic movement, where you can just find and create little opportunities to practice.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you look for those opportunities, the easier they are to find, and the more they just kind of become second nature. So
Mm-hmm.
for some, it's when they're going for a walk, pushing the stroller, perhaps when they're going to feed their children. It's a moment where they can practice a little breath work, or perhaps after they do drop off to help reset their nervous system. So finding the things you have to do every day anyway, and then just taking a moment and practicing breathing, enjoying your breathing, the fact that, each breath is sacred and amazing, and it's easy to take for granted, but
Mm-hmm.
the moment you can't breathe, you realize how primary it is to your experience.
It's like when you have a cold, right? And you're like, I've never appreciated the ability to breathe through my nose
Yeah,
more than when I have a cold. You're like, I just never have appreciated the fact that I can do this all the time until I can't anymore. So as you think
yeah,
about, because obviously that's first and that's primary, and you said something in there that I actually want to spend one more second on before we go into the next pieces, which was because I thought it was really well said, which is kids co-regulate off of us, right? They learn from
hmm,
us, right? So you work with a lot of moms. I work with a lot of moms and dads, and the idea of being healthy for your kids feels like a strong word, but like where the benefit, or they are going to get benefit from that. So as you think about that, from the perspective of moms who already kind of feel a lot of, I don't know, I'm sure you feel it too as a dad, like the weight of being a parent and like how much is at stake. I don't know, like I have moments where I'm like, how, like their whole childhood is in our hands, and they're gonna be or like the joke of like, you're gonna talk about that later in therapy. Like that one's on me. Like the stakes of parenthood, I feel like, are there, and I don't think that weight necessarily needs to be expressed to parents. I think that we all feel it. Um,
yeah,
but as we think about what does it look like to maybe help our kids in this co-regulation standpoint, how have you, even as a dad, experienced how you are impacts your kids more than what you say, or even sometimes what you
yeah.
do, just like how you are and what you're doing impacts them more than what you
The
say.
way, yeah, it's really important. We all, or maybe not all, it's a sign that you're a great dad, that you feel the weight of the responsibility. We also don't want it to become a crushing burden, right?
Yeah.
Our kids don't need us to be perfect, and when we
Mm-hmm.
make mistakes, that's an opportunity as well to show them what it looks like to own up to it in a developmentally appropriate way. So it can feel kind of very, very high stakes all the time. And part of the breathing practice is to try to help kind of calm that down a little bit. For me personally, I have a lot of stuff going on. Um, I was diagnosed with depression at an early age. I'm
Mm-hmm.
pretty dyslexic, moderately dyslexic, and I also have ADHD to a high degree. So much of, and I'm also in recovery for 21 years.
Wow.
I grew up in Queens, and I kind of had to go through this very dark rite of passage, um, and movement. And there's three things that really help me kind of rescue myself: movement, meditation, and what I call connection to nature. And so for me, so much it is a live by example thing, and lead by
Mm-hmm.
example thing for me, because I need movement. Otherwise, I can see how I don't show up for my kids
Yeah.
if I miss my workouts, if it becomes glaringly apparent. And as our little co-regulators, they're mirroring back to us when things are off, and their response often isn't when things are off like, oh daddy, what's wrong. It's often like, at least with my kids, test the boundary.
Yeah.
I feel weak. I feel weakness and instability, so I need to push against it and see what's here, and that's instinctual. It's not
Yeah.
malicious. We can turn it into malice. It's very easy and seductive to do that, but our kids are there to help us grow. And
Mm-hmm.
if I find that to be a very empowered, you're still the leader in many ways, and there's a little bit of a hierarchy there, and there's different responsibilities. But this has been very liberating for me, of like seeing them as a mirror, and what can I do to help them. And often what I can do to help them is what I can do to help myself as well, which is, breathing, strength training, cardio, all these things that help me feel good in my body. So, um, yeah, I'm trying to think if I have a specific story around it, but there's tons of stories.
Yeah. Well, that was really well said. I the idea of kids as mirrors. I've been kind of like, I had this realization somewhat similar to you, which is like our kids are us, just with less of a filter. Like,
Mm.
they say the things, they do the things, but they feel all the same things that we feel. And it's, I'm sure you've seen the like jokes of like, videos of trying to gentle parent your kids, and then you go out and then you like punch a potted plant or something like that, because we feel all those same things. And so it is a little bit of like, okay, they're gonna mirror what it is that we're doing, what it is that we're feeling, and the things that we can do to help them are the things that we do to help us. So I think that you put out a lot of content about this, and I think it's super an important thing, and something that I say a lot along those lines, which is the feelings of it being selfish as a parent, as a mom, to take the time to go do a workout, right? Or to, I mean, or to take time, it's me time, sort of thing. And what is self-care, right? That lives on a spectrum, certainly, to like, all right, what is actual self-care versus like what is, you know, internet worthy self-care. So as you think about, like, oh, I'm going to take a 90-minute bubble bath versus like actually doing things that, and it's not to say that that's wrong one way or the other, but when you think about like the time, what does it look like to take the time to take care of yourself, and how that reflects back on your kids? I'd love to hear you kind of talk a little bit about that, because I think that you have just a really cool perspective on it.
Thanks. Yeah, I love talking about this stuff, and like I said, I work with a lot of moms, and I also have worked with kids quite a bit. Um, it's an opportunity to grow, and for many, I mean, your question seems to be around like, how do we start doing this? Is that
Yeah,
correct?
or even just the mindset shift. I think there's a little bit of
Yeah,
a roadblock, or
yeah,
a limiting belief before we even begin to do it. But like, am I being selfish? Like, how do we overcome
right,
that limiting belief, or that
right.
barrier to entry?
So let's just, that's a great question. Let's just acknowledge that this is, for many people in general, and mothers especially, this is kind of an ancestral inheritance, or a generational trauma. Um, and it's really this either or thinking, that it's either
Mm-hmm.
me or the kids, right? And so many people think like, time is the issue, or energy is the issue, or being in pain is the issue. And what I've found in 23 years of experience is that people's way of thinking, this black or white thinking, is the issue. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
2 minutes of breath work when I'm doing the dishes in the morning, that can't be enough. I need to do more. It's like, and so there's this black and white thinking, and then this culture of no pain, no gain. And so much of what I do, I think, is help people unlearn that, unlearn that in a way that works for them and start where they're at. So maybe it is just a minute of breathing in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, and really then paying attention to how you feel afterwards, because we know from several studies that the people that are most consistent are the people who pay attention to how they feel after they do their workout. It's not the people that have aesthetic goals and try to motivate themselves like that. It's not people that even have health goals. I don't want to have cancer again, or that's not what keeps people consistent. What we know keeps people consistent in the literature, it's called positive affect, like immediate positive affect. So it's a pleasure-based process, and we're unlearning no pain, no gain, and we're unlearning this black or white thinking that a workout is all out effort for 45 minutes to 60 minutes, perhaps in a gym with a cute outfit on. I mean, these things just become such hurdles for people
Mm-hmm.
in their minds. And there is a real ancestral, generational trauma with mothers that, um, that they have to put themselves last. And the amazing thing is you can shift that. And by starting to put yourself first and working out, you're going to show your daughter, not only are you going to show up for her in a different way, and your sons as well, but you're going to show her that working out matters. And that creates such a powerful, I mean, you've got maybe 5 to 10 years where your kids really look up to you and want to be like you, right? And like that's a golden opportunity. And after that, it gets a lot trickier, and my mother has this little sign, little tchotchke sign in her house that says, raising teenagers is like nailing jello to a tree. And I always found it really, I mean, it's like, yeah, it's true, but it kind of misses the point, or totally is the point, depending on the way you look at it. The way I look at it is, yeah, because at their teenage years, you're not supposed to be raising them anymore, like
Yeah.
they are now really working to raise themselves up at that point. So looking at it as a golden opportunity, as hard as the early years are, that this is a time where you can embody for them, lead by example, and show them the way, and they will want to be like you. Um, it's just so important, and it's this other part of your question, which is an excellent question, is it's this black or white thinking, right? It's either for them or for me. And
Mm-hmm.
I, instead of thinking of selfish, I like this concept in Buddhism of wisely selfish. That something can be both selfish and wise at the same time. And this, idea of putting on the oxygen mask first so you can put on the oxygen mask for your kids is, I think, a very wisely selfish concept. So that's an interesting thing for people to think about. And then the last thing I'll say is that so much, I think, of what we do with movement is get into the brain and help reprogram people's thinking. Like you can hear me
Mm-hmm.
say black and white thinking or all and nothing thinking, or no pain, no gain are bad templates for organic systems like the body.
Mm-hmm.
But hearing it isn't the same thing as actually working through it and like beginning to move, beginning to breathe. And as you do that, you actually start to rewire your brain. So it's, I think, so much of what I do or try to do is help people rewire themselves from the inside out using movement. And that's, well documented in the studies as well, around how movement creates new neurons in the brain and the areas of memory, learning, and attention. So, so much, I think the problem also is it's so superficial, right? It's so much about like the way we look, and of course that's important. We should be able to take pride in our bodies. Um, and at the same time, like if we stay at that level and don't go deeper, then we're really doing ourselves and our kids a disservice.
So much awesome there. So I want to go kind of one chunk at a time. So I actually want to finish or start where you finished there, which is the idea of aesthetic goals, because I think that this is another maybe limiting belief, particularly for moms who are in this stage where we're thinking about, is it selfish for me, right? then is this vain, right? Like I'm sure you hear this all the time. Like, this feels like a vain goal, but I'd really love to lose 10 to 20 pounds. Right. And, or just like feel good in my clothes. And I think that again, this is unlearning generational trauma to some degree of like, this is either what everything, right? It's everything about movement is about this, or I feel like it should, like we almost swing the pendulum the other side, which is, no, this is all for my kids and I'm doing it. And we haven't maybe found that middle ground of like, it's okay to want to look and feel the way that you want to. And at the same time, like what gets you in the door, as you talked about, isn't necessarily what keeps you in the door. And so as you're thinking about rewiring the brain around that mindset shift of like, hey, it's okay to have aesthetic goals, for lack of a better term, or to have physique goals and things like that, but at the same time, like what's going to keep you doing this is going to go deeper than just the number on the scale or your pant size.
Yeah, shame in general and body shame, and there's plenty of it, especially heaped at women, is not a great sustaining, motivating factor. And, one of the most powerful words in the English language is both. Yeah, it can be both things at once. Now, when we talk about women, there's tremendous pressure for them to look a certain way. And of course, there are plenty of vain people out there, but we also need to acknowledge that, for a child, the first 3 years of life, they're totally, right? This is unique to the human species, but they're totally dependent on
Mm-hmm.
the care of adults. And a lot of little girls are imprinted at a young age that they get attention, and right, attention equals survival for small children. And they get a lot of attention based on the way that they look. And it gets imprinted at a very early age. So a lot of women are older and are starting to feel like less worth because they don't look a certain way. And so it puts a lot of pressure on them to look a certain way, but then they feel vain because they know they shouldn't feel that way. And so there's a lot of healing that can be done around this topic in particular. I started working out to look better naked. I started out when I was
Yeah.
17 and I was an addict and I was in love with a girl who was into really muscular dudes. And I started working out like a madman, but then ended up helping get me sober. And then I
Wow.
injured myself and I had to learn through that. And so your goals should evolve. I mean, it's great if your
Yeah.
goals can evolve. It's a sign that you're making progress, and you can both want to take pride in your body and honor the fact that there's more to this than just the way you look on the outside. I know you use metaphors in your content, and I like that. And
Mm-hmm.
one that I use sometimes is like making that the guiding principle. Look, if that gets you in the door, that's fine. And
Yeah.
hopefully, you work with a coach or consume content that is uplifting and speaks to this deeper aspect to training and movement. At the same time, it's important to recognize that, yeah, I mean, our goals should evolve, and um, shame is not going to really help us be consistent in the long term. So there's a lot of things that get tangled there that
Mm-hmm.
kind of through movement, through an intelligent approach to movement, can be disentangled and made well. I had another point, but it's jumping from my mind right now.
No, that's all right. Well, maybe if it comes back, you just interrupt me. But the idea, I think the two things that we said there that are common, which is there's guilt and shame associated with like doing something. This is selfish, right? And then there's guilt and shame associated with either how I feel right now, right? In my body, I should feel ashamed
Hmm.
because I'm not living up to some standard, or I feel guilty because I want that, right? Like there's a little bit of that. Like I feel bad for what I want, and that can be really a tough thing to navigate because it's like, okay, I'm trying to do it for the quote unquote right reasons. But I'm in the same boat as you. Like I started working out. Like the first time that it actually stuck for me was I was like, I want to look good for my wedding. Like I was
Mm.
like, my wife's gonna, wedding night. I want to look good, and I fully expected to go back to where I was, but it was in that process that it shifts, and now it's very different, right? And I think that you probably feel the same way. Is I got little kids, and the idea that like, okay, I don't really care if I'm shredded to bits or my shoulders are, whatever. It's just like I have a different goal at this point.
Mm,
And it
mm,
will likely shift again at some point. So,
right.
but the idea of like whatever
Mm,
gets you in the door and overcoming those initial hurdles of like it ought to look a certain way. I think that that's a little bit like the should piece of this. Like I should want to do it for this reason, or I should
mm,
be doing this, right? It's me or the kids,
mm,
right? There's a
mm,
little bit of the pressure of, and I think so, not to, you don't want to spend time pointing fingers at social media, but I think we get a little bit of this where we're more seeing other things that it feels like it ought to be, and I think the external pressure of what do we do. And so the idea of like just starting, I think, is what you talk about is like, hey, if we start with this, then that can help us overcome that, even with the lower barrier to entry thing. So breathing being first, and then movement, that's just, breathe, move, right? That's the next piece of it. So
mm,
when you
mm,
think about bringing movement into the piece of it, or into the fold, because I think, again, there's an expectation of what movement ought to look like, right? I'm going to go to the boot camp class 6 days a week, or I'm going to do
mm,
P90X, or I'm going to do, I'm sure you've
mm,
seen all the iterations of this over the course of 23 years. Where do you like to start movement and the relationship with movement? Because I think a lot of people have maybe a negative relationship with movement, the no pain, no gain. Like I'm gonna beat my body to a pulp
mm,
because it's not what it should
mm,
be. If I was in shape, I could be
mm,
able to do this,
mm,
right? Like there's a little bit of that
mhm.
mindset.
This is a great question. I mean, I start movement. I just, in 23 years and 15 different certifications, I cannot find a more brilliant path to begin movement than what evolution figured out for the only species that can walk upright, as far as we know, on two legs. And so developmental movement, and I do this with my adults, and it's amazing for them. But I, once they're breathing, I get them breathing while being on the floor in different positions. And I really don't like the word mobility. I mean, I think it's important to have mobility, but it so quickly gets co-opted by this no pain, no gain mindset, and people are like trying to force their body into positions where really what we want to do is relax into those positions. If you ever held a baby, you know how soft and supple they are. And so when they roll around on the ground, that's how their brain maps out their body from the inside out. And we all have those maps, and after years the maps start to get not so good. It's like Google Maps when it doesn't refresh and it has you like driving into a river, and you're like, that can't be right. That driving into a river.
There's no road here. Like in the office.
So the driving into the river is bad posture. It's feeling weak. It's being in pain. It's not having good of awareness of your body. So you might roll your ankle. You might injure yourself. But you also have poor interoception, right? Interoception is our ability to sense what's happening inside of us. Am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I not breathing? Am I asphyxiating myself? Like knowing, you know, am I dehydrated? All these things you can get better at through movement. I am a huge fan of sensory exercises. They shouldn't even be called exercises because it immediately conjures something else, but of movements that really prioritize sensory input, the information coming into the body. And I can do that in person with people with touch, and there's a whole other healing element to that with energy. But people can do it on their own on the floor and use the floor to help their brain map their body, use the floor to help relax, to be more clear of what you're feeling inside so you don't have adult tantrums and are better regulated. So we do all kinds of breath work on the floor, and it's really unique compared to anything else that I've seen out there. And it took me a good 15 years to develop it. And it's often the opposite of what people think they need, but then they pop up from the floor and they just feel like, oh, I'm taller without trying. Like burnt out, right, is like having no energy, but also feeling like exhausted and beat up. And the opposite of that is feeling like you have a surplus of energy, but you're also relaxed, right? And that's where you want to be as a parent. You want to have an abundance of energy and also feel relaxed because then you can react in a way that is, you know, your best self. Whereas and you're beaten down, beaten down, beaten down, and we have to acknowledge that parents are set up to fail. We're supposed to have a tribe around us, aunties, uncles, grandparents, all living. That's how the human species developed, and now we have to try to do all of it on our own, or maybe with a second parent. I have a lot of single moms, so they don't even have that luxury. It's incredibly hard. So we need to be really intelligent about how we approach movement. And the thing that I had forgotten was the metaphor, which was, I say, making aesthetic goals your guiding principle is a bit like driving a car while looking at the rear view mirror the whole time, right? Like
Mm.
you're basically, what happens after you've been doing the thing is then later on, or what we could just call a lagging indicator, right? The way your body changes is a lagging indicator, but more of a leading indicator is how you feel and your relationship to movement and breathing. And so I have people focus on that, and that's like looking ahead of you at the road and working with the obstacles. Whereas if you're looking backward, it's very hard to keep moving forward and still saying, "Oh, I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet." Looking in the rearview mirror, or with your
Mm.
head turned behind. It's like, and people
Mm.
crash, and you know that can also become an opportunity.
Yeah, I love that analogy. The idea, and I've talked about this has been a big thing for me, and we talk about it, in business, but also just in general is process oriented versus outcome oriented goals. Right, we are in charge of and this is a parenting thing too. Right, we are in charge of the process and not the outcome, and so the outcome is a lagging indicator. Right, it's a result of the process, or the way that I phrase it is, or I've heard it phrased is, we're a fruit driven people. Right, we want the fruit, but you don't get the fruit unless the tree is healthy, and you don't
The roots.
control.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're not a root driven people, we're a fruit driven people, but we have to be in
Right.
charge. We're in charge of the roots. That's what we're in charge
Right.
of. And so
Right.
as you think about this, I love that analogy that you had there. And so bringing it back to, like, all right, this process oriented stuff, which is the movement and the breath work and things like that. So let's get super as practical as we can here, because I think that this is, everybody listening is like, I want an abundance of energy, but to be relaxed. So what does that ground based kind of flow look like for you? What are some of the things that you like to do? And I would love to hear it too, because there's some things that I
Yeah.
do, which is, ground based breathing, and
Mm.
some different movements on the floor that I do in terms of warm ups with myself and with clients and things like that. But I would love to hear some of the things that you've established over, obviously 15 years.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, it's a lot about the way you do it. So just having this mindset of touching the floor and letting it touch you, because the more you relax, the more the energy of the floor moves into you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, for instance, most people know what windshield wipers are. You lie on your back, you bend your knees, your feet are about, shoulder width or so, and then keeping the feet on the ground, you rock the knees from side to side.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a nice way to start to mobilize a spinal twist and rotation in the hips. But we'll do it as, like, I've created this practice called primal energy, and it's really a principle based practice. So with and much of it is on the floor. And with primal energy, there's some, guiding principles. The first one being focus on what feels good, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
hard for a lot of people because their body has become a body ground, a battleground of shame and trauma and
Yeah.
past bad experiences. So then there's breathing, right? Lead with the breath. So trying to initiate movement with the breathing, because that's the way it's wired in your body already. But for
Mm-hmm.
most people, it's a bit disintegrated. So we lead with the breath. We try to use as little tension as possible, right? Most
Mm-hmm.
people assume exercise, movement, more tension, better. Most people don't need more tension and more effort in their life. They need to learn how to relax and trust their body and do it optimally and efficiently. So we're actually practicing that on the ground. They might, when their knees are over to one side, stop. And then the final principle is spread the energy through the system. So it's so easy for us when our knees are one way to forget about our arm and start thinking about something. And no, if your knees are to the left, you reach through the right, you feel your back. We're getting all that sensory input. We're being active participants in our experience of having a body. And then we might stay there and then do those rescue breaths. And then as we inhale, diaphragm pushes down. We're massaging the organs, the ribs, our are getting nourished and moved in ways they don't normally get to move. And again, all of that is creating sensory input that gives people better maps into their own structure and the systems that keep them feeling healthy and happy.
I'm going to use a metaphor here because I think, and let me know if I'm on the right track. You get an ear infection. You're aware that you have an ear at that point. Like we're not normally aware that we have an ear. Like it just exists. It's cartilage. It's just on our heads, but like we're not thinking about the fact that we have an ear. But you get an ear infection, all of a sudden you bring awareness to it, and you're like, I have an ear, and it hurts. The idea behind this is bringing awareness to things that maybe we're not currently as aware of. Is that maybe a decent analogy of what we're trying to do here in terms of purpose?
Definitely. The body is, they can't create a drug that doesn't already exist in the body in some, natural endogenous form. Our body is this amazing pharmaceutical cabinet of opiates and neurotransmitters and growth hormones and things like that. And there's a lot of pleasure when you feel good,
Mm-hmm.
those things are released. So what we're doing is, yes, we're not waiting till the ear infection or the stomach cramp to feel a sense of joy in our body. And what's amazing is that what we focus on, we feed. So we can
Mm-hmm.
begin to have a relationship with our body where we know what we need. Waking up. Yesterday, I woke up 4 a.m. Kids woke me up. I really wanted to work out. I wasn't sure what I should do. I really had to go through a whole process around that, and then I was able to adapt my workout. So developing, one of my first students for Breathe, Move, Nourish said, you taught me that there's more tools than just a hammer. And
Yeah.
it's true. Most people only have a hammer and they just try to bang it in different areas. And they bang it, they bang the hammer when it's mobility, and they bang the hammer when it's high
Mm-hmm.
intensity interval training, and they bang it when it's cardio and Peloton, but they never learn what a paintbrush is or what a chisel is or what, a screwdriver is. And so I like the medicine cabinet, metaphor a little bit better because I think that's a little more direct.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're helping people feel better in their bodies using the floor and being aware of what they've been given, right? Because it's all a gift and it's on loan. You don't get to have it forever, and that
Yeah.
doesn't need to be something you feel guilty about, but it can be something you celebrate and honor.
Yeah. Well, the common phrase is right. If the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, right? And so the idea is we're gonna just do what we know, versus recognizing that we have a whole toolbox, we have a whole medicine cabinet. Where there's plenty of opportunities for us to kind of get celebrate the things that our body can do in a different way. Because again, the all or nothing thing is, if I only have a hammer, right, if the only thing I know how to do is beat the crap out of myself, then when I can't do that because I'm injured or I don't have the time or I don't have the bandwidth right now, or whatever it is, then it's all or nothing, right? I can't, there are no nails. I cannot, or like my hammer is broken, I'm stuck here. And so the idea of like, how do I maneuver around that? So when you think about, I think this is a good segue into the last N here, which or the last component, which is to nourish, right? Because all of that brings, right, we're, our body can nourish us, right, through the movement, right? So we're breathing, and then the movement nourishes us in terms of the chemicals and things like that in our brain, dopamine and all of these things that we get as a result of movement. But then we can also be nourishing to help support these other things that we're doing. And so as you think about, right, that's obviously not necessarily the last in terms of priorities, but in terms of like, hey, this is a natural flow for you when you're thinking about the nourishing piece of it, and how do we complement all the things that we're doing on the breath work, the movement side of things, and help that support, again, shifting the mindset piece, because there's so much kind of wires crossed in terms of the things that we've believed about nourishment and nutrition and all of these things. But I think nourish is a cool term because it encapsulates more than just like, it's not breathe, move, nutrition, right? It's breathe,
Mm.
move, nourish. And so I think that the verbiage there is really interesting. So as you bring people into that, what's your mindset on that piece of it?
I love that you've picked this up. I mean, the idea is that when they breathe, they're learning to nourish themselves. when they
Mm-hmm.
move, they're learning to nourish themselves, right? So I struggled with putting that word in it, and now I especially after hearing you say that, I feel even better about it because
Mm-hmm.
it's a nourishing approach all around.
Yeah.
If if you get the best diet in the world, but you don't know how to breathe and relax, you might be able to stick with it, but you're going to be miserable. You're going to
Mm-hmm.
feel deprived. You're going to feel because so many people are trying to regulate themselves through food and substances. Of course, it works in the short term, but in the long term, it builds a hole. So for me, the breathing and the nourishing type of movement comes before the nutrition and the more obvious forms of nourishment because they're at the foundation. It's not my choice. That's just the way the body works. I have
Yeah.
people who we've never talked about food, but just by getting them to breathe and relax, they stop smoking pot. I have a mom who's a year sober, and it wasn't even her main goal. I
That's
mean, she
amazing.
didn't. That's not why she thought she was coming to me. She
Yeah.
mentioned it to me. I'd like to stop. You know, I'm sober from alcohol for years. I really know this is a crutch. By filling ourselves up in a primary way, like with breathing and movement, we don't have as much of the holes we need to plug in food to try to
Mm-hmm.
make ourselves feel better. So that's the first thing, and then the second thing is my approach with food is very, it's very simple. It's like, what do you enjoy eating? There are no
Mm-hmm.
good and bad foods. You do a
Mm-hmm.
food log, we look at what you're eating, what you don't think is working, and then we work through that. But for me, it's really tertiary because if we don't get the breathing and relaxation down, then they're always going to be fighting against that. Whereas if they learn how to breathe and relax, then the need to overeat and emotionally eat is cut drastically. I mean, for many
Mm-hmm.
people, it's like a tenth of what it would normally be.
Well, I love the word nourish because if we flip the context for a second, right? You think about your kids, right? Like like a nourishing mother, I think would be what a lot of moms would want to be known as, right? Like but
Mm-hmm.
that's not just about the food that you give your kids, right? That's maybe like the least important thing of like what would qualify from the outside you as a nourishing mother. It's caring for, it's giving them what they need, right? And so then when you think about it, I'm learning as you're saying this and maybe trying to make some connections for myself here. But when you're focusing on the breathing and then the movement, then the nourish is filling in the gaps, right? It's supporting that. And so it's the same idea of like, what does a nourishing mother do? It gives the kids what they need and gives them the space and the opportunity to do what it is that they're trying to do. It's not like, oh, I'm doing everything for them, but it gives them the energy to support that. And so the natural ability of becoming more aware in your body, I think, is a lot of times what happens because there's the exterior of like, this is the diet, right? I'm following this plan versus the interior, which I think you and I are fairly similar with, which is I can't like the idea of like, I'm going to set your macros when you don't even know what you're eating and you don't know what your body needs. Like you're just unaware of it. So that's like a foolish thing. Like I'm going to set a target that's it's impossible for you to do because you're not aware of it versus becoming more internally aware and making the changes kind of inside out. Going back to the beginning, I think is a really interesting way to put it. So as you once you kind of find that piece, right? And people are how can you tell kind of the story of how does that naturally fit into all right, I've got my movement, I've got my breathing, or I got my breathing, I got my movement. Now, what am I trying to do? Like, how does the nourish piece, like, what are those gaps that we're trying to fill with, nutrition, but like just in general, I'm nourishing me. Like, how does that mean a little bit more than just like what the food is that I'm eating?
It's a great question. I mean, the nervous system, right? We have fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. That's like the activation or the
Mm-hmm.
accelerator. And then we have rest and digest, which is like the break or coasting. And, you know, that's how we're wired. So we take this approach of helping people relax first and foremost, and we want that to carry over from breathing and movement into food so that they
Mm-hmm.
can really enjoy what they're eating. For many people, just the idea of trying to figure out what they're going to eat automatically starts to be some low level PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for a lot of reasons around self sabotage, self manipulation, disordered eating, and perhaps eating disorders, etc. So the gaps, it really depends on the person, um, But whatever their diet is, they all can work. I mean, you do need protein, fat, and carbohydrate, but starting with the macros, that's never my approach with
Mm,
most people that I serve. It's really about, what do you enjoy eating? What do you think is missing? It's a very empowering approach, because our bodies really, once that interoception, right? Once that ability to understand what we're feeling and experiencing, we can have a much more intuitive and spontaneous relationship to food versus a very managed and, trepidatious, high stakes
yeah.
experience to food. Like, one meal is going to make or break you. So it's very much a general philosophical approach, and then the way that it looks like depends on the specific person. And I have
Yep.
them keep a food log. It's not, they don't keep a food log forever, but they do it anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks, depending on the person. And we use that as a tool. We make adjustments, and then, based on how it goes, we then might make a couple more adjustments. But we really try to pick one or two things
Yeah.
at a time. I mean, often it's just breathing a little bit, drinking water more, or getting more protein. Those are probably like the three things, because a lot of people just scarf down their food. And of
Mhm.
course, then they can't digest it as well. And it's not what
Yeah.
you eat, it's what you absorb that matters.
Well, and this is coming back to the what you bring awareness to, you know, then you're going to be more mindful of it. So that's the idea. Is like oftentimes when people do a food log, they're just like, "Oh, I didn't realize that I had 12 snacks between lunch and dinner," because and can be aware of what's happening in that piece of it. So kind of want to finish here because I think that you said something there that's like a semi-popular term nowadays in the industry, which is the intuitive eating, right? And so intuitive eating, I think, has been co-opted by people as like maybe it's not actually intuitive eating, right? Like most people don't have the or flexible dieting, right? Like this kind of movement, which I think is maybe a
Mhm.
positive step in the right direction, but maybe like from like you must follow this, right? It's a step in the right direction, but has been a little bit co-opted as an excuse to just eat like a total jagaloon, some of the time and not be maybe it's not actually what intuitive eating looks like. And I think maybe the threshold for how do we intuitively, like where do we know we've kind of gotten to the point where we can listen to our intuition? Because that's maybe it a little bit,
Mhm.
right? The idea of like
Mhm.
listen to your body, right? Like we hear this phrase of like whether you need to take a rest day or not a rest day, like listen to your body. It's like, well, how do I know when my body's lying to me? Right. And so some of this is becoming
Mhm.
more aware of it. But how can I get to the point where I like, okay, my intuition and what I'm naturally feeling is maybe the direction that I should be going in versus the point leading up to that where it's like, no, I actually probably shouldn't listen to what I think I want to do because what I've if I'm listening to what my body wants, then I'm going to have pizza for dinner every night, sort of thing. Like, how do I navigate that murky waters at least at the beginning?
It's hard, and that's why having a coach is so great. Someone to answer to and provide feedback, and hopefully, a great coach, I always say, lovingly holds back up the mirror of truth, just reflects back to them what's actually going on, because awareness is the gateway to freedom. It really, really is. So by focusing on the breathing, like, and you nailed it. I mean, like, there's so many terms that are so awesome, but they get co-opted, or they get, used so much that they start to lose their meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Functional training was one, and now intuitive eating and wellness and all these other things. And that's why it's so important to have an embodied connection to what that actually means, because
Mm-hmm.
if you get caught up in the words, then you're always getting pulled around by whatever the next marketing fad is. So that's why an embodied approach is so important. And how do you listen to your body, right? Like, everyone says listen to your body. Get on the floor, roll around, and breathe and relax, and try to really be present with the sensation, right? Like, if there's one thing you do that as a practice for 5 minutes a day. Do it before pickup and notice how pickup is different. Do it before your yoga class and notice how your yoga class is different. Do it before you go out to dinner and notice how your relationship to the food is changed. And all of that will give you feedback that you can then integrate. And of course, we all have moments where maybe we don't make the most empowered choices. And at the same time, we can develop, you kind of have to know where you're at. If you feel, oh, I want to have pizza and a burger, great, eat it. And how do you feel right after? Do you
Mm,
feel good? And that's possible. Maybe you really enjoyed it. Well, then it's great. Or do you
mm,
feel bloated and gross and you scarfed it down and you still don't feel quite right? Like just being aware of that creates a feedback mechanism. So the body, from my perspective, it doesn't lie. The body's not capable of lying, but our ability to interpret the sensations can totally get lost in translation,
mm.
and that's why my approach is very sensory based.
Yeah. Well, I love that because I think that even just a good example of that parallel is communication, right? You might say something, and how I interpret it is not how you intended it, but it doesn't mean that you said the wrong thing. It's how I interpreted it. And so a lot of it has to be, I have to learn how do I perceive the world, how do I perceive my body, and a lot of that comes from exactly what we talked about is we got to do the thing. So to kind of put in, and like oftentimes we take too big of a step to be like, okay, I have to go from here to a level 10, whereas starting again small with it might not feel like enough, but the little things are the big things. If we do the
When the
little things, yeah,
Consistently, that's
yeah,
it. I mean, I always say consistency is more powerful than intensity. I mean, you're
mm-hmm,
nailing it, especially for parents.
100%. Well, in just do parenting thing, and I know we want to wrap up here, but like consistency over intensity, right? Just think about teaching your kids something, right? So this is again, we are our kids, but like we're just more learned and set in our ways. If I'm going to teach my kids something, right, and they have a tantrum, right? My kid, we're at the grocery store, my kid wants candy, and I say no, and they throw a tantrum, and then eventually I give in because we're in the grocery store. And I'm like, just to get them quiet, right? I give them. They're going to learn that if I throw a tantrum for long enough, I'll get what I want. Versus if I'm consistent, even though it's hard, with even the smallest thing, right? Consistency on the smaller things allows me to be a little bit more consistent with the bigger things. But we can oftentimes try to be, all right, I'm going to do all the big things, right? And so if you can't, let's just take, this, I'm not going to try to be, set a standard for the audience, but like if you aren't able currently to find 3 minutes in your day to do breath work as an example, then buying a new workout program or starting a new diet, you're not ready for it. And it's not because you're not good enough to do it, but like we haven't shown consistency, and that's where I think a lot of people fall short is like we're set up to fail from the beginning because we haven't learned how to be consistent with the little things before we go then to the big things. And we oftentimes think that we have to do the big things, where if I was just consistent with the little things, as you said, like you start doing breathing and then becoming aware of your body and moving a little bit, and then you're just like keeping a food log, all of a sudden 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks later, your relationship with all of this looks very, very different. And it becomes a lot easier for you at that point to be like, okay, what do I want to do? Like, do I want to do a little bit more of a workout? Do I want to do, but like, we want the quick fix.
It's exactly that. It's that foundation. So many parents are overwhelmed, exhausted, and have no gas in the tank.
Mm,
And I mean that by like energy. And then they
mm,
think the thing they need to do is to go out on the racetrack and
mm,
push the limits of the
mm.
station wagon that they've become, which can be very humbling. But this is where the metaphor breaks down. This is where the metaphor breaks down, and
Oh,
the
carry it
human
all the way.
body is
Yeah,
so
that's
much
what
more
I do.
magnificent than a machine
Yeah, I carry him all the way to the
because we
end.
can transform. We can transform into a Ferrari slash Chrysler minivan slash helicopter that's never existed before. The human body is amazing, and
Mm,
no car or technology will ever be able to compete with it. But
mm,
that's just my perspective.
love it. Well, Jonathan, I really appreciate you coming on and your perspective on this, man. I think that this was really, really a cool way to frame this conversation, and love your expertise. Any kind of last minute nuggets or where people can find you if they want to connect with you?
Thank you. It's been a total pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you more.
Yeah.
Just a last minute thought is start where you're at, enjoy your breathing, keep track of it, and focus on what feels good, and do that regularly. And then, as far as you can find me on Instagram at bmn.coach, it stands for Breathe, Move, Nourish. My website is purestrength.nyc, and I'm happy to answer any questions about what we talked about. You can send me a note through either of those two mediums.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll link his website and his uh, Instagram handle down in the show notes for you there. And listen, if you made it all the way to the end of this episode, just send Jonathan a message and just say, hey, I listened to the episode, because there's something just like really encouraging about that. Again, the little things are the big things, and just a little note like that, I think would go mean a lot to him. It always means a lot to me when I hear from people that they made it to the end. It doesn't have to be a question or anything like that. Just like, hey, listen to you on Jeff's podcast. Doesn't even have to be it was good. Just like, hey, I listened to you. But if it was, I'm sure that it would be encouraging for him, because again, the little things are the big things, and bringing awareness to it can be helpful. Go ahead.
And I would say anyone that is interested in this primal energy practice, I have
Yeah.
what's called a primal energy reset, which is like a 7-day reset to help people calm their nervous system, build up abundance, and do it all through breathing and floor work. So if anyone's interested in that, I can send that their way. Just
Oh,
send me a note.
absolutely. Yeah, I'm gonna get that from you.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that'd be awesome. So if you're here, that's an easy thing. Hey, can you send me the thing? And a great way to get started. So appreciate you coming on,
Yeah.
Jonathan, and appreciate your time. And thanks to everybody for listening. And reach out to Jonathan. Follow him on social media. He posts just like really cool perspective stuff. And just love seeing what he does there. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.